Thank you. Today we're starting our series on Jesus' I Ams, and we're looking at I am the light of the world, and that's taken from John 8 and verse 12. Starting off, I just wonder what memories you have of school trips. It's a rhetorical question. We, when I was at school, only went on a few day excursions. Don't know why. I think the teachers couldn't risk taking us more than to a couple. So one of them was to a trip to France, which was very brave of them. And they brought all of us back. And the other was to a theatre in London. I've got absolutely no idea what we saw at the theatre. I've just got a memory of kids behaving badly and looking down at a stage a long, long way away. I do have a vague recollection of paper pellets being blown through biro shafts, which was, of course, the main function of biro pens at the time. That's what they were made for. But I wonder if my experience would have been any different if I'd been given a front seat to the stage performance, where John does just that. He gives us a front seat view into a number of encounters that Jesus has with his critics. So let's have a look at the Gospel of John, chapter 8. Time travel with me and imagine the scene as Jesus is in the temple in Jerusalem, where a crowd has gathered around him. We're starting at verse 3. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? They were trying to trap him into saying something that they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer. So he stood up again and said, okay, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. Jesus spoke to the people once more and said, I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in the darkness because you will have the light that leads to life. The Pharisees replied, you're making those claims about yourself. Such testimony isn't valid. Jesus told them, these claims are valid, even though I make them about myself. For I know where I came from and where I'm going. But you don't know this about me. You judge me by human standards, but I do not judge anyone. And even if I did, my judgment would be correct in every respect because I'm not alone. The Father who sent me is with me. Your own law says that if two people agree about something, their witness is accepted as fact. I am one witness, and my Father who sent me is the other. I wonder what the people Jesus was talking to would have made of that statement. I am the light of the world. Now, we can often imagine that the first century Jews lived in a bubble of Jewishness, but there would have been many that were aware of Greek philosophers such as Plato and Socrates, Aristotle, and others whose teachings are still referred to today and who lived hundreds of years before Jesus' birth. And I was tempted to go into a bit about how the ancients have influenced our culture, but Sally Ann put the brakes on that and told me not to go on about them because she was of the opinion that you couldn't care less and would be more interested about what God's word had to say to you today rather than learning about the Greek philosophers. And so I couldn't argue with that, could I? So suffice to say, I don't think that the people of Jesus' day were in any way backward or ignorant of world influences. They may not have had the latest IT gadgets or Google to rely on, but they had more time and probably more inclination to talk to each other about world issues than you and I probably do. And let's not forget, they had relatives all over the world as well, who would have fed back the current thinking of the day. And we talk today about being in a global village, but back then it wasn't so different. But of course, their heritage was very strong in their narrative. Their culture was founded on a rhythm of life, with the temple being central. And every year, the key moments in their history were rehearsed by celebrating feasts and pilgrimages. The Feast of Booths, which is also known as the Feast of Tabernacles, is the seventh and last of the festivals on the biblical calendar. It's recorded in Leviticus 23, also known as Sukkot in Hebrew. God wanted the Israelites to observe this festival by living in temporary shelters for 7 days as a reminder of when their ancestors were in the wilderness. They had also lived in temporary shelters as they traveled from place to place as nomads. And what was it that guided them during this time? Well, in Exodus 13:21, we're told that the Lord went ahead of them and he guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud and provided light at night with a pillar of fire. And so this was the light that the Israelites would have been familiar with. So when Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," if you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness because you'll have the light that leads to life. The account of their ancestors being delivered out of slavery from Egypt would have been what immediately sprang to mind. They'd also been familiar with the golden menorah, the candelabra that was burning continuously in the temple as a sign of God's presence, again as instructed in Leviticus 24. But this wasn't Jesus putting himself forward as the new Moses. What he said was far, far bigger than that. He said, "I am the light of the world." Not just the light of the Jews, but the light of the world. And he has been the light of the world, and he still is the light of the world. Queen Elizabeth II is the longest reigning female monarch of all times, and is one of the most influential women in the world. This year, once again, she gave such a clear testimony of her faith in the message that she gave at Christmas when she said, "The teachings of Jesus Christ have served as my inner light, as has the sense of purpose we can find in coming together to worship." She didn't mention Socrates, Plato, or even Aristotle, but Jesus, the Christ, the anointed one of God. Which brings us to the question, what about you? What about me? What is your guiding light, your beacon, your reference point? Now, it's easy to look at people who do not know Jesus and think they really do need Jesus to be their beacon. But what about us? Where or who do I turn to when people let me down? When I'm ripped off financially? When my character's undermined? When I'm not treated with the respect that I deserve? When idiots cut me up on the road when I'm driving? When the latest social media trend tries to suck me into their bandwagon? Do I turn to Jesus of wisdom as my guiding light, or do I stumble around trying to find my own way? Often I stumble around, whereas the sensible thing to do is to turn to Jesus. I may have been a follower of Jesus for many years, but I'm still aware that I've got so much to learn from him. The society that Jesus was born into was a hotbed of revolution, subjugation, and racial segregation. Now, sometimes religion, media, and a lack of personal connection with Jesus can leave people with an impression that Jesus was a bit grey, a bit boring, lacking in emotional connection, a bit distant, remote. And that's so wrong, because Jesus spoke with authority. He had a presence about him. He knew who he was, and he was confident in that knowledge. He wasn't intimidated by people of wealth, privilege, and power, but neither was he sucked into the emotions that can be so common to the disenfranchised, being resentful, angry, hopeless, and without any voice. Jesus didn't have to wear a mask or put on a show to try and fit in. He was comfortable in his own skin. And here's the thing, not everybody liked him. And he was okay with that because he wasn't trying to impress anyone. And also, he knew the heart of man. John 2:25 says, no one needed to tell Jesus about human nature, for he knew what was in each person's heart. He didn't have an overinflated view of people, but neither did he put people down. So how did Jesus speak into this society, which is in so many ways like ours? It's an important question because it can help us when we grapple with those same issues in our society today. There's many today who feel downtrodden and unappreciated, who feel angry inside, who desire revenge, whose anger and frustration overflow into violence and social unrest, probably physically restrained at the moment due to the pandemic, but still evident on social media and in the media itself. But as you listen to what Jesus says, be warned, you may not like what he actually says. So as Jesus lays a backdrop to his famous Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:17, he says this: don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. Then he goes on to say, verse 18, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. So if you ignore the least commandment and teach others to do the same, you'll be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who obeys God's laws and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. If you're not sure what God's law is, you can check it out in Exodus 23. And heaven and earth haven't disappeared yet. So Jesus' words are still relevant to us. So his message to those who are taking advantage of their position of privilege and power was exactly the same as to those who are inclined towards violence and social unrest. Jesus said, obey God's law. And that message is still relevant today. Obey God's law. But Jesus goes further than that, and he gets very specific. Matthew 5:38 says this: you have heard the law say that the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it for 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. So Jesus is saying that the bar set by the law is really very low. Jesus says, do better than the demands of the law. So to the victims, the oppressed, the disenfranchised, he's saying, don't be intimidated by bullies. Be generous towards them. Don't seek revenge. Keep your heart in a place of trust in God. Put your trust in God, who is the only one who can really bring judgment to pass. Now, when we're the victims of wrongdoing, we want immediate action to put things right. But God doesn't always act like that. In Deuteronomy 32, 34 to 35, God says this about those who are doing terrible things. He says, am I not storing up these things, sealing them away in my treasury? I will take revenge. I will pay them back. In due time, their feet will slip, Their day of disaster will arrive and their destiny will overtake them. I wonder how easy it is to put your trust in God, to trust him to bring about a truly, really just solution. Because very often what we want isn't a just solution. I wonder if you find it a more natural reaction to default into a solution mode. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to sort this out myself. And from my own experience, it doesn't always work out so well. Yet there is a lot of injustice around. We thought about that in relation to fair trade fortnight. And Jesus doesn't condone that or turn a blind eye to it, but he does encourage us to focus on what we have control over. And what we can have control over is our attitude towards others, and to trust God to deal with judging those who are not following his ways by doing wrong things. You know, this is so relevant when we think about how we should approach the issues of color, of race, of sexual orientation, of injustice, of equality, modern day slavery, and even other religions. We need to always treat everyone with respect, love, kindness, and care, whilst at the same time keeping our hearts in a place of peace and praying for God's kingdom to come, because God's kingdom is the best that there is. But Jesus engaged also with those who were in a position of power in society, some who were abusing that power. And there are many ways that someone can abuse their position of power and privilege. That position can come from just being in a relationship with somebody else. That brings you into a position of power and responsibility as well. Jesus, you remember, even had to rebuke some of his own followers who wanted to call down fire from heaven to burn up a Samaritan village that hadn't been very welcoming towards them. They were trying to use that influence and that power over the village that had been unkind towards them. And you'll be familiar with Zacchaeus the tax collector, who'd been fleecing those who came to him to pay their taxes. Interesting, isn't it, that Jesus didn't lay into him and tell him what a terrible person he was, but he picked him out from the crowd, and in the face of public disapproval, he honored Zach by going to his house as a guest, as an honored guest, and eating with him. And then there was the religious leaders of the day who said one thing, but didn't live up to it themselves. And Jesus was very honest with them, as he said, "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity." That's in Matthew 23. Now, was he being harsh there, or was he just shining a light into their conscience so that they could be honest with themselves about what they knew the truth of the situation was? And then when he was brought before Pilate, he's not afraid and overwhelmed by the situation. I think I would be. But he looks beyond the office that Pilate holds to the man as he questions whether Pilate is prepared as a man to recognize the truth. John 18:36, Jesus says to Pilate, "You say that I'm a king. Actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth recognize what I say is true." And so to each person that Jesus encounters, he speaks to them personally, as an individual. He invites each one to respond to him on that level, at a personal level, to be honest with themselves and to recognize the truth of what he says. He doesn't go out to embarrass them, to flay them with a whip, but he speaks to them and shines a light into their lives. Now, many years ago, I was traveling to Switzerland for a missionary conference, and on the coach, there was a man who was obviously very well known to many of the others on the coach. He was a successful businessman and a Christian, and he had quite a gathering around him. They were like bees around a honeypot, just wanting to chat to him and talk to him. And I was quietly minding my own business, wondering why this guy was so popular. But after a while, he turned around, he excused himself from the crowd, saying, I want to spend some time with this guy, with me. And he sat down next to me and introduced himself. And we chatted. Now, I still remember, I still couldn't really tell you who he was or anything about him, but I remember him singling me out and taking the effort to spend time with me, to chat with me. And isn't that exactly what Jesus did? He saw people. He took time to make them know that they mattered in his busy schedule. Now, in the face of public opinion, and he was really not liked for doing this, Jesus invited himself to Zach's house to have that conversation with Zacchaeus even. And Zach's life was turned around. When Jesus met with Nicodemus, who was a prominent Pharisee, he met with him after dark in secret, where he could have that heart-to-heart conversation with him. With the woman who was brought to him in the temple, apparently caught in adultery, he treated her with kindness, but also with honesty. Go, sin no more. To those who were using the woman for their own ends to try and entrap Jesus, he spoke into their hearts and conscience, and they just had nowhere to hide, and they drifted off. And we've seen that when he was brought before Pilate, Jesus saw Pilate, and he spoke to him not as the man who held in his grasp the power of life and death, but as a man who was in need of facing up to the truth, of seeing the truth. Now, I find that quite challenging. Now, it's easy to bang the drum and show support on social media about the latest outrage, but how willing are we, how willing am I to take the time to engage with people rather than just with the issues? Jesus is the light of the world. He is our beacon, our example. And in the darkness, a beacon provides light, illumination, a focus, and a reference point. So let me encourage you today to allow Jesus to be your beacon today. Amen.